I have the honor of providing the introductory words to John Falk's keynote, which will now come next. It is well possible that most of you attending here at this very moment already know who John is, but if only as a question of courtesy, let me quickly introduce you to John. John is the founder and director of the Institute for Learning Innovation and professor at Oregon State University. He's a leading expert on free choice learning, learning guided by a person's need and interest, and for example, well known for his identification of 5 museum-specific identities reflecting visitor motivations. But today he won't talk about those, but about well-being and why this concept is extremely useful in defining and measuring the relevance of museums. I'm delighted to turn the microphone over to my friend and colleague, John.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you. Thank you. So let's see. Let's get this going. Share. Wonderful. I love it when technology works. So, hello, everybody. It's an interesting for me to be giving this final keynote of the session after our 3 previous keynotes. And I was tempted to busily go back and modify my talk based on all that came before, because as you'll see, many of the things I'm going to talk about in some ways mirror previous comments by Timo or Vera or Lori. In other cases, they slightly deviate from those comments and thoughts, and that's all to the good, as well as comments by a number of you over the course of this meeting, people like Martin and Dave Yuko and others. And so just know that I'm aware that of sometimes that overlap, sometimes disagreement, but ultimately we all have to make our sense out of what we're here. So, we're talking about relevance, and like others, I too was trying to figure out how we define relevance, and to bring it down to its essence. To be relevant is to be meaningful to individuals. And so the question, are museums and other cultural organizations meaningful? And again, the caveat I make is that I'm going to very much focus on museums as a community cultural organization that I know well. This is where my research is focused, but I do believe that my comments are likely to be equally relevant to other cultural organizations and institutions, with, of course, some nuances. So, if they are meaningful, in what way? So, as I commented yesterday, historically, people have disproportionately attempted to think that the value of institutions like museums resided in their tangible assets like collections and buildings. And that may have been true at one point, but that's not true today. Primarily, the meaning of our institutions lie in their intangible assets, the experiences that they create for the public. And so when I start talking about value here, I am going to focus on those museum experiences. And that's not to say that's the only way that an institution like a museum has value. So the question then is, how do we begin trying to define and measure something intangible like museum experiences? Where to even begin to define this type of value? And many people have attempted this. Certainly, Timo was talking about this, but I believe the answer, as has been commented on, particularly in the wake of Timo's talk, is you have to begin with the public themselves. And it's not about how curators, educators, or dare I say academics or researchers define value. you have to begin by trying to understand how the public who uses these institutions themselves perceive value. And it turns out that over the past 40 plus years, dozens of researchers have interviewed thousands of people about, if not tens of thousands of people, about their museum experiences. And there have been, I would argue, 3 key findings collectively from those. So virtually all could recall and talk about their experience, regardless of whether that visit occurred days or even decades earlier. That in itself is not trivial, which I'll talk about. By and large, most people's memories were positive. I mean, obviously there's some people who were unhappy, but they are in the decided minority. And then interestingly, thousands of memories, and most of them are quite unique and very idiosyncratic. And of course, being social scientists, by and large, people have come up with lots of different ways to slice and dice and categorize and try and make sense of these findings. But I would argue that the single most striking and non-trivial aspect of these findings is the durability and salience of these memories. Why shouldn't museum experiences be so memorable, and what does that mean? So, starting with first principles, what we know about humans and memory is that most people don't remember much of what happened in their life. In fact, only the tiniest fraction of what happens in our lives, in fact, what happens in a day, is memorable. If I ask you tomorrow to remember what you did today, you'll be able to remember some things, but most you won't. You certainly will be challenged to remember what you did a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, 10 years ago. So the fact that virtually everybody can remember that they went to a museum and what they did there is really important and non-trivial, because that is not the case for most things we do in our lives. So what makes something memorable? Well, to begin with, people only remember things that are meaningful to them. And then, of course, we have to ask, what does that mean? What does it take for something to be meaningful? And the biological answer to that is that meaningful things are things that impact a person's life, things that impact their well-being. So then that raises the question, what is well-being? We can certainly conclude that since museum experiences are highly memorable, they must also be perceived as meaningful. And so de facto, they must all be perceived as affecting people's well-being. Then that brings us back to the question, what do we mean by well-being? So well-being is a term that is frequently used, and I would argue abused today. It's become quite in the vernacular. But the way, it's important to appreciate that the way that I think about and define well-being is quite different than the way it is commonly talked about. I'm not talking about well-being as doing yoga or having balance, in terms of being able to be calm and meditative. Those are certainly aspects of well-being, but they aren't well-being. And that well-being at its core is actually not primarily a psychological phenomenon. It's first and foremost a biological and cultural survival phenomenon. In other words, the ability to perceive well-being evolved as a proxy for fitness. And I'm talking about fitness in a Darwinian sense, that guy. Survival of the fittest. Living things cannot actually know whether something they do right now or not is going to enhance their fitness. But we evolved to have the perception that certain things that we do feel good, feel right, or feel bad, feel wrong. And those things evolved biologically, genetically, and culturally to correlate with enhanced fitness. We've evolved to discover that when I feel sick, Timo was feeling sick 2 days ago. That's generally not good for your long-term survival and fitness. And so you do things to avoid being sick or putting yourself in danger. And by the same token, we have evolved to appreciate that it feels really good to be happy, to be loved by others, to have a nice meal, to have a full belly, not to be thirsty. Those things are correlated with positive fitness. So we go out of our way to do things that feel good and avoid things that feel bad. But the problem is well-being, again, different from the way it's normally talked about in psychology as some attainable goal. I want to get to the top of the mountain, then I can be on the top of the mountain. Well-being is ephemeral. So today I feel good, tomorrow I don't feel so good. Today I feel loved, but tomorrow, my significant other is yelling at me and I feel terrible. And so we're constantly in pursuit of well-being, and it's a never-ending process. And so we have to think about this, being able to assess well-being as a very situation-specific and ephemeral experience. And that provides a lot of useful insight. So let's think about well-being in humans. Well, humans are complex organisms, and over time we've evolved literally tens of thousands of ways to achieve well-being, including many of the ways that I've talked about. But these approaches to well-being basically fall into 4 types, or I've lumped into 4 basic categories. So, and I'm going to start with most recently evolved and go back to the deepest roots of our evolution. So starting maybe as long ago as 500,000 or even longer, but certainly 350,000 years ago, people started to have the ability to think more abstractly and to think about spirituality and creativity and identity. And to derive satisfaction from those kinds of things. I'd like to comment that, I live in a beautiful house and I can look out the window and I can see deer, I can see sunsets, and I can see flowers blooming and things like this. I will sit back there and say, what a beautiful sunset. But I know the deer that are walking by could care less about the beauty of the sunset, They're not seeing the world through that kind of lens, but people do. And museums create context for wonder, interest, and identity building. That's one of the things that museums do really well. And it's a way to support and satisfy well-being. Learning is basic to life. Bacteria learn, but humans in particular, and higher apes in particular, are really, really good at exploring and understanding their world and using learning as a vehicle for predicting and enhancing both their current life, to understand what happened in the past, and to try and affect what happens in the future. Choice and control is really essential. And again, museums turn out to be really interesting and important places for satisfying human curiosity and learning. That is one of the attributes that museums afford well-being to the public. Humans are quintessential social beings. We're not the only social beings. Sociality evolved hundreds of millions of years ago, and in mammals, 16 million years ago. But people are highly social. We derive extreme satisfaction by being with family and friends and groups. We value loving our close friends and relatives, being loved by our close friends and relatives, and we actually really strive to have people respect us and to be respected, to show respect and be respected, that whole notion of self-esteem. And again, museum context, as has been pointed out over the last couple of days, one of the things museums are good at is facilitating those kinds of social interactions. not as frequently talked about. We tend to pretend that our physical well-being isn't important, but if anything, the recent events of the last couple of years and the COVID pandemic should remind us that we are not immune from the challenges of the biological world, and that we put ourselves in places where we feel safe and secure and that do not threaten our health. And again, museums were challenged for those reasons in the last couple of years, but people historically go to museums because they feel secure and safe, that these are places where they can feel restored and rejuvenated and get away from the day-to-day hassles of life. That too is one way that museums satisfy well-being. Okay, so what do we do with that information? So if the primary outcome of museum experience, primary relevance of these, is that it enhances these 4 types of well-being, how do we measure them? That's Dungambu in Denmark. Shout out to Mark. So measuring museum well-being. Well, the good news is, as I said, over the last 40 plus years, and in particular over the last 15, 20 years, people have spent a lot of time talking to folks about why they go to museums and what value they derive from those. We can piggyback on that research. We can use that research on, for example, identity-related motivations to understand how to capture those qualities that people say are the values that bring them to museums and that they derive. And they have not historically been framed through the lens of personal, intellectual, social, and physical well-being, but that doesn't mean we can't use similar language to reveal those outcomes. But then if you remember back what I said before about memory and persistence, that the things that are most valuable to us are the things that we remember. So longer term outcomes, i.e. memories, are more valuable than things that only last briefly. So I may really enjoy eating an ice cream cone, but a day later, that ice cream cone is a distant memory, if a memory at all. But if I had a wonderful experience with my children, that's a memory that will last for days and weeks and months, and is something that I will much more highly value, which means that we can't collect data in the museum. If we really want to get at this value, we have to collect it over time. Now the question is, how long a time? That's another question. At any rate, so I did a pilot study to try and test the feasibility of these ideas. And it was, pardon the phrase, a coalition of the willing. I was looking out for, asked institutions if they'd volunteer, and I got 6 very different institutions, 3 institutions in the United States, 2 in Canada, 1 in Europe, the latter being Herika, which is a science center in Finland. Billings Farm is a living history farm in upstate New York. History Nebraska is a relatively small to moderate size history museum in the middle of the United States. Museum Toronto is interesting because it's primarily a virtual museum in Toronto, Canada. Museum of Life and Science is sort of a hybrid natural history museum, science museum. Again, moderate sized institution in the American South in North Carolina. Toronto Zoo is self-evident. And again, Herika is a fairly large science center. But I was looking at trying to come up with metrics that were generic and not content specific. And I was able to collect data. And the bottom line is what we can see is that did you have these kinds of outcomes? 1 was not at all. 2 was it lasted an hour or 2. 3 is equal to a day. 4 is a week. 5 was 2 weeks or more. And we can see that the means here are these outcomes of well-being were lasting typically about a week or longer. And that's really interesting and really important. And again, for those of you who are data wonks, you'll see that actually in a couple cases, the outcome was a 5, which meant that everybody said it lasted more than 2 weeks. 2 weeks or more, which meant that actually my arbitrary decision to collect the data 2 weeks after the actual event was too short. I needed to extend that timeline because I got a ceiling effect. And obviously 4.5, I got several 4.5s, which means I'm also getting a ceiling effect. So in subsequent research, I'm pushing this data out. Here's another 5. Pushing this data out even longer. In fact, this pilot study was done not with a random sample. It was done with a self-selected sample. It was members, by and large, people who were on their mailing list. It was a few hundred people. It was a proof of concept, but I think it proved the concept that this could be a way you could measure this. Currently, we are collecting data from literally roughly 10,000 individuals across 20 institutions, 8 in Finland, 12 in the United States. All of that data will be a random sampling of visitors to those institutions. Instead of having, these were all based on 2 items for each of these dimensions, we'll be using 4 items for each of these dimensions. And again, we'll be sampling a month after the event. And so then the next 6 to 9 months, we'll have really solid data on the value that museums generate from a real large sample of visitors. But I think what this suggests is that it is possible to actually directly measure something intangible like well-being. But again, as I suggested, it's not an annual assessment of value. It's a snapshot. It's literally asking people, when you went to that museum a month ago, what was the nature of the experience you had? Did you have these kinds of outcomes? And if so, how long did they last? Did they last a day? Did they last an hour? Did they last a week? Did they last a month? People can answer that question because it's actually quite tangible. In the same way, I can't ask you what you learned. It's a meaningless question to ask you what you learned last year. But I could call you back in a month and ask you, what did you learn when you went to the Connected Audience meeting a month ago? And if I make it even more concrete and say, here are 20 possible learning outcomes you could have had from this meeting. Did you have any of these outcomes? And if so, to what extent did they change your understanding about value? That's a concrete question that you could answer. And it's much more valid way and ultimately reliable way to measure something like value. So in conclusion, what I would argue is that this new approach opens up new and hopefully more valid and reliable ways for museums to describe and measure their relevance, to determine the critical public value they create. What's important is that this is based on good theory, basic ecological theory. It's measurable, and it leads to outcomes that are at the core of human existence. It places museums in a way to talk about what they do relative to the same kinds of basic important outcomes that healthcare, public education, public has, be framed in terms of these well-being outcomes. But the other thing, the value that it provides is it provides a more theoretically sound, theoretically grounded way to think how museums enhance their relevance and value. And I won't go into any of these in detail, but the gist is you can think about, again, in terms of these categories, we can take what we know, we've learned through trial and error. Again, virtually none of these items, these 10 items that I've bulleted here, are novel But by reframing them within this context, we can ground them in a way that we can more intelligently and successfully improve the quality of the experiences that we provide, because we can understand what is at the core of why these things are important and how we can build relevance into that. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I will stop sharing, and we can open this up to questions, and I can magically reappear on your screen. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That's certainly given us a lot to think about and a lot to really feed our thinking this afternoon about things we can do differently. So, Dorothy, please, you have a question or comment.
Thank you, John. And I just want to start with a banal question, just a technical one. You said that you collected the data later. I find it just from a practicality point of view interesting. How did you go about collecting the data? I mean, obviously, it's much easier to grab the visitor at the institution when they're there.
You bet.
So I just, could you share that experience, how you went about that?
Sure. I will tell you how we're doing it at the moment with this really large sample on site. We literally are approaching visitors with a little handheld device and saying, as they enter a random sample, random, and asking people, would you be willing to help us better understand something about the impact we're having on your institution? And if yes, hand them a tablet and say, would you be willing to give us your first name and your email address and permission to contact you in a month? And then we can, through the magic of technology, then automatically that person gets stuck into the system, and a month later we send them an email. But what it means is we are sampling 10,000 people with the hopes that we'll get 5,000 responses, because knowing full well we are likely to there'll be attrition, but that's the price you have to pay, and that's part of that trade-off in terms of time. The longer we wait, in theory, the longer and more valid the responses would be, but the longer we wait, the greater the attrition. And so you have to figure out, what is the sweet spot where those two lines cross? And I don't know, but I'm guessing at this point a month. And by the way, the other thing is we are, although there are pros and cons to this, we are telling people if they answer our survey, we will give them a little gift as an extra tease, 10 a free coffee or 10% off at the gift shop. Nothing great, but something as an incentive.
I'm just going to add to your answer, John, that work that John has done in the past has involved interviewing people 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years even, I think, right? After museum visits to get a long-term view, which may be the ideal way, but becomes impossible when you want such a large sample. So this work is building on previous work that you did in person. So Ivana, please.
Thank you. So as I'm interested in the non-visitors, I would really be curious if you can make, or if you can see in the data difference between like extensive visitors and visitors who are visiting for the first time.
Yes. So potentially the answer is yes. In the pilot data, we didn't have a large enough sample, and I didn't ask those questions. But we are going to ask those questions in this large sample, and again, that's one of those things when you have a really large sample size, you can begin to look at some of those independent variables and begin to tease out those differences. I will say one of the tantalizing findings from the pilot data was I did ask about income, and that did seem to be an interesting preliminary finding that people with lower income actually derive greater value from their museum experiences than people with higher incomes. And I was basically segmenting it above the median and below the median, so it was just that. I hope that persists, because that would be really interesting and important data. And we will, and so stay tuned, and hopefully we'll be able to answer that question.
And Volker, please.
Yes, hello, John. Thanks for the great presentation. I think I would like to mention that you really focus on the ability of a museum to serve people systematically, and not the other way around. Often, at least in Germany, that they really think the subject of all research are the visitors themselves. Also, you have to know them, of course.
Yes.
And that you put the visitors into the center of the museum's work. I think you have really to mention it again and again, especially in Germany, say it again. But we have to consider that museums or other cultural institutions really work in a broad field of different stakeholders. For example, as I said yesterday, I think, and it's society, education, in the area of education, political areas, stakeholders,
Yes.
also in the economic terms. And so a museum has really to find a role, but nonetheless, I think it is very, very helpful to argue to museums how important visitor research is.
Yes, well, thank you, Volker. And I should say, first of all, I fully appreciate and acknowledge that museums are not perfect institutions. Cultural institutions are not perfect institutions. They do not serve everybody in society. They aspire to serve whole groups of audiences that they don't currently serve, and should well be doing that. But I purposefully opted to put it a little bit in psychobabble, to take an asset-based approach as opposed to a deficit-based approach. So rather than focusing on what we're not doing and who we're not serving, I decided let's try and understand what are the benefits to the people who currently utilize museums. It's a little backwards look, but with the notion that if this is the value that it goes to, that we can measure for people who do use museums, if you believe the approach that I take, that well-being is a universal human need, everybody has these needs, and actually everybody is satisfying these needs in one way or another. In fact, that's another way of thinking about the way I think about well-being. We all are the descendants of people who are successful at well-being, or we wouldn't be around. People most of the time have well-being. It may not be optimal well-being, but we all have well-being, because if we weren't, we'd be dying, literally. So other people find other ways to do it, but the people who use museums find that museums and other cultural institutions like museums are satisfying in this way. Well, this gives us insights then into how we might actually satisfy the needs of people who don't go to museums. So that's really the approach that I'm taking. It's not to suggest that this is sufficient, but it is a foundation of knowledge that will allow us to be better in the future.
Thanks, but I have really to be honest, sometimes I'm working in just 20 years in visitor research in museums, especially, and sometimes I think the well-being of the visitors are not top priority of museums work.
Yes, and that is absolutely true. But the wonder of human beings is that we will make it work for us as best we can. That doesn't mean the institution can't make it easier or better, but no one would go if it didn't serve their well-being. Is really the framing that I'm taking. And so even when we're not doing it as well as we could, we're actually doing it better than we think.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rebecca. Oh, you need to unmute. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I was wondering, John, if your initial study as the pilot or the new study, if you're differentiating between people who come to the museum and just sort of more passively engaged. So look at the exhibitions, but don't necessarily participate in something additional, like a program or an educational session, etc., a tour. Versus those who are more passive and they go walk through the exhibits, they don't really talk to anyone, they have a very insular experience. I was wondering if the data shows something different between those two groups.
Again, in the pilot study, because it was a short seat of the pants kind of thing, we did not look at those variables, but we are going to be looking at those variables in this larger study, and we will have a sufficient sample size, hopefully, to be able to tease out those relationships. So stay tuned.
Tibor.
Hello to everybody. Thank you very much, John, for sharing out this very interesting approach with us. But I have a question. This time period of 1 month, as far as I understand you right, you regard it to be that this approach yields more sustainable results when waiting after a month compared to interviewing visitors right after their visit. But I'm not so sure whether this is really the case, because maybe it's just another reality. There may be different realities right after the visit and after a month or a year or whatever. I mean, in the meantime, if you take this month, things happen. There are factors that interfere in your results. We all know that people, for instance, tend to idealize their experience. In their memories, later it turns out better, nicer than it was possibly before. Visitors talk to other people, talk about the experience in the museum, receive comments, and this all may shape a certain attitude. So don't you think there is a problem with all these factors having interfere in these results that maybe, maybe become some kind of misleading compared to interviewing them right after their visit?
Well, and maybe this is just a philosophical difference, but I would argue that those things that you are describing as potential noise in the data, confounding variables, are the important variables. Because what is important is whether they talk to other people afterwards. What is important is if they think about it afterwards. What is important is if it becomes part of their life in a way that it's memorable. What is less important, and frankly, in my opinion, more trivial, is what the short-term reaction is. Because if you ask somebody, tell me how you responded to something you just said, I'll tell you. But if you ask me in a month, what did you think of that thing you saw, and I can't even remember that I saw it, then that's less interesting to me. And so life is complex and messy, and that is the data that we should be collecting. And again, trying to minimize variables is to actually sometimes simplify reality beyond what is important. And I should also say that my colleagues and I have collected data where we tried in part to answer this question, where we would literally talk to people in the museum. We talked to them one day later, we talked to them a week later, we talked to them a month later, we talked to them 6 months later, and we found that, and this is in part what Judy was alluding to, we found that people talk about their museum experience differently in the museum from, say, a week later, but how they talk about it a week later does not change much, a month later or longer. And so you need to give people time to know whether these experiences are memorable. And sometimes it takes time for those memories to become memorable, because memory isn't laid down instantaneously. And yes, other events are part of it, but the truth is that that's the same thing. If you believe constructivism, which I do, the thing that people are most likely to pay attention to and remember when they're in the museum is the things they did before they came to the museum. So if you don't understand that, then you actually can't make sense of what they're doing in the museum either. So it's all very complicated, and we're making trade-offs, but I consider this to be an acceptable trade-off.
Okay, final remark from my side. Yes, that's holds certainly true, but the things that happen later and that may shape somehow one's memories about their past experiences, about their past visit. As longer as you wait, you have less control about it, as seen from the point of view of the museum. Museum has, to some extent, control about the effects and images and pictures that evolve right after the visit. But if people talk to other people in 1 month or 1 year, whatever, there happens so much that a museum may not control, and it has no influence on it. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. And again, we can choose to disagree, but I would argue that that is a problem with the way we've conceptualized the museum experience, and assuming that our control should only be what happens from the moment they walk in the door to the moment they leave. But we should in fact expand that box and try to see the visit experience as a longer experience. And obviously, it has, it's diminishing ability to control those events, but that doesn't mean it's zero. And that we should abrogate our responsibility to try and have influence over those experiences weeks before people come and weeks, if not months, after they leave. But again, that may just be a point of disagreement at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Vera.
Thank you. Also from me, thank you, John. That was super interesting. And I have 2 maybe nerdy questions as well, like Tibor had. The first one is probably quite easy. Let's say I'm a museum or a cultural organization, doesn't matter which one, and I don't have the resources or any options to do that later on, whenever later is. Would you say, okay, please definitely don't do it directly after the visit because it doesn't make any sense what you find out, or is that better than nothing? That's my first question.
And the honest answer to that is I don't know the answer. So, I mean, literally, this line of research, at least for me, is less than a year old. And so I don't know all those answers. So I'm beginning with what I think is the right way, the ideal way to do it. And I even found that the pilot didn't seem to be ideal. So I extended that to a month. I'm hoping, I mean, at the moment it's expensive research. I'm hoping to make it less expensive over time and easier to do. And again, you start with a lot of questions and then you do a factor analysis and discover you can actually ask fewer questions, and maybe we can do it over shorter time frames, but I don't have the answer to that right now.
Just thinking aloud here, could it be an option to ask them twice, like once directly after the visit and then again sometime afterwards to see if the answers are different?
Sure.
I mean, it can still mean that well-being means something different as well if some time passed, of course, but that would be super interesting.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, and we should do that.
Okay, I dare to ask the second question. Thank you, John. The answer is probably no, because I know you're right in the middle of the pilot project. And I'm just wondering if you had any chance to already look at the data and say if you see differences in answers of different social groups, or even if you look at these diversity criteria that we were talking about yesterday, because my guess would be that there are probably differences between those groups, and that it's not random who is part of the sample in the very beginning and also later on. Yes.
So again, in the pilot study, there was some indication that race, ethnicity kinds of data were significantly different. And again, non-majority populations were more likely to find it valuable, but the sample size was so small, I couldn't say that with any confidence. So I'm hoping that maybe in the next sample, if we collect that data, which we may or may not, because again, we're still in the process of deciding what variables to pick, independent variables, that will emerge. I know in data that I collected in Los Angeles, a large random sample, there was evidence that non-majority populations found more value in the California Science Center than majority populations. And I have a theory about why that was the case, but it's just a theory. So, but the short answer is no, I don't have that data right now, but hopefully.
I thought so. Yeah. Okay, so then a last comment, John. I find that a really, really important research project. Thank you for doing it.
Thank you. Okay.
Judy, you have to unmute yourself.
Oh, well, we'll take Martin. Martin's next.
Thank you. Thank you a lot, John. It's such an interesting project. There's a short comment, also what your Tibor and Timo discussing. When you look at why people visit museums, I haven't, all the motivation I've seen is that you have been there before or that you have talked with some. So this long term is, as also from a marketing perspective, the most important. It's important because that's what we decide. I just have a comment or an observation, which I don't know. When you saw these 4 museums you have chosen, I could see that the museum which were not physical but were this Toronto, I could see that the score on the social was very low.
Correct.
I guess also I think that's very interesting also in terms of whether we should put out our what we should do digital or not.
Yes.
Are you investigating that further?
Well, not at the moment, but that would be really interesting. So 2 comments, and again, I was going through this quickly. One comment, and thank you for pointing out, is that actually different museums had different affordances. So some museums, obviously, a museum like a zoo was very high on social. The museum that were very family oriented, like that a museum in North Carolina, very high social. Whereas the virtual museum and that particular program was literally a workshop on First Nations people and how to deal with them ethically. It was really high, off the charts. Everybody was a 5 intellectually. They clearly thought they learned an awful lot from that experience, but there was no social. Nobody thought it had any social value whatsoever. Now, I'm not in a position to generalize whether that was because it was virtual or because of the nature of the program. But I think the other thing that is interesting and certainly is built into the methodology, as I said, it's designed to be content neutral, and so it potentially is generic, so that you can compare programs within a museum as well as across museums, even museums of different content. But again, we have to take those pilot results with a grain of salt, just because they're relatively, a couple hundred people across the entire sample. I'll feel more comfortable making generalizations when I have thousands of a sample size of thousands.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And Suzanne.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting, as usual. I was just curious, do you think that the fact that you ask the visitors, can we get back to you in a month, will that itself have an impact on how much they remember or value the visit?
You certainly
keep thinking about it all the time.
Yeah. Well, you certainly cannot assume it has no impact. So obviously, just by, if I walked up to you and you agreed to talk to me, that's a bias, right? Just by talking to people, that's a bias. The question is, how much of a bias? Is it sufficient bias that we have to worry about it? I often talk to people who don't do research in places like museums, who worry about the fact that you're interacting with people in this way, or observing people, and doesn't that affect their behavior? And the evidence is not much, because in fact, certainly even tracking people in museums, people turn around and say, oh God, I forgot you were there. Because it's a free choice setting, they're there for their own reasons. They're not there to please you. And so they likely are not going to spend a lot of time trying to do something just to please you. And so my assumption is, can I assume it has no effect? Obviously not. Do I assume it has a large effect? I do not believe it's likely to have a large effect. I do not believe, because I think most people, in fact, one of the reasons why I'm assuming that we will get such a bad response rate, 50%, is that most people will have totally forgotten that they agreed to participate in this bloody survey a month later. And I'm hoping that we can entice them to even open up the email and say, oh, that's right, I agreed to do that. So
do they get the gift before or after?
Oh, no, they only get the gift after, after they complete the survey. So that will be a motivation for them to complete the survey, but actually they don't even know what the gift is. So
Thank
it's
you.
not, yeah.
I'm wondering if some of our participants from other types of cultural organizations, for example, Louisa, think that this might have applicability for the theater or the symphony. Can you imagine this kind of work in your setting as well?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I had some trouble unmuting myself.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think what I was kind of thinking throughout it, that I think it's very applicable in a theatrical setting, because it's almost like the root of theater is this kind of like social well-being experiment, right? Like if you think about like really going back to like Aristotle, it was like all about catharsis and like this kind of like social experience. So I think it is like I think it's kind of innate to theatre almost, to consider theatre as an important tool in social well-being. I think exactly what form that will take, I'll have to think about a little bit. But I mean, I think like with physical security and restoration, it's interesting because we're almost trying to achieve the opposite of causing a feeling of security, right? We're trying to cause more of a feeling of unrest and provocation.
Yeah, so 2 comments, Louisa. First of all, well, 3 comments. First comment is I certainly hope it's true, because I have a proposal pending to try and collect some data in performing arts. And I hope the performing arts people will agree that that might actually be relevant, and give me a chance to actually figure out what those outcome variables might look like, many of which are likely to be very similar, but it's likely that some will be quite unique to that context. The other comment I'll make is that actually evolutionary psychologists and the people who have done theorized at least on the evolution of language would suggest that performance, as it were, is at the root of language. And so, yeah, sitting around the fireplace and sitting around the campfire and sharing stories is a very fundamental human phenomenon, and so which is at the root of all performance in theater and dance, as for that matter, and music. And then the third comment relates to that whole question that came up earlier in our conversations about being, particularly on day one, about, you know, comfort versus being provocative, having fun versus, you know, learning. Those kinds of I think are false dichotomies. But if we take at heart the notion that this is the bottom line, is people have to walk away having well-being, having your beliefs challenged is not an inherently negative thing in terms of well-being, as long as you can walk away feeling that it was useful to you, that it was valuable to you, that it was positively provocative and instead of just being in your face. And so I think that actually is a really interesting implication of this theory, testable hypothesis, that would suggest that there's nothing wrong with challenging people, but you have to allow them to have resolution if you want them to walk away feeling like it was a positive experience for them.
Thank you for jumping into this for us, Louisa, but I wanted to balance some of the museum conversation and think broadly. So thank you. Great. Well, thank you very much, John. Are there any last? I don't want to stifle any questions or comments. Dave, please. Well, this will be our last question before we go to break.
Lisa, did you want to say anything more because your hand was raised?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see that.
John, I worry that the term well-being may not fully capture in people's minds what you're talking about, and whether you considered other terms like maybe personal value in terms of selling the concept and getting other people to appreciate what you're really getting at.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Well, I did think about that. In fact, I did originally thought that I would use an entirely different term because the term well-being has lots of baggage. So the first blog I wrote about this about a year or more ago, I used the term equipoise, which is a real English word, and it means balance. And actually, it's interesting. The concept of balance, which is at the heart of this notion of well-being, it's almost like homeostasis, which is another word. You know, at the basic, most biological notion of this, are not friendly terms, and I discovered that nobody knew what the hell I was talking about. They couldn't make sense of this new term, even though it wasn't a totally new term. And so, you know, it was 6 of one, half dozen of the other. So pick your poison. So I can come up with a new term and define it, because no matter what term, you'd have to define it. And then no matter what term you pick, either people don't know what you're talking about or it comes with baggage. And so I just decided to go with well-being. There you go. And hope that I can convince enough people to think about it in the way I want them to think about it. But yeah, appreciate the comment though. Thank you.
So thank you very much. What a great way to start the day. And we'll take a 15-minute break now.